Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to February's All Aboard Ohio statewide meeting. Um, for those that aren't as familiar or are new to the call, All Aboard Ohio is a 501c3 nonprofit. We advocate for primarily passenger rail development throughout the state of Ohio. But we also shifted our mission early last year to kind of align with a lot of other transit programming that we've got across the state. So although we are still primarily focused on passenger rail and that development, we do also talk about things like public transit, what we like to think of as kind of that first and last mile service, and then also just moving people around in a more efficient way, whether that be pedestrians, bicycles, anything that doesn't have rubber wheels. So thank you for joining and welcome today. So again, today we are going to build on Rachel Coyle's presentation from October of last year. If you did not get to see that, I would invite you to watch it. It is wonderful information about how to advocate at the State House. Rachel's a dear friend and has been doing this for a very long time. So when you're done with this, if you've got some more time this morning or later today, I would encourage you to visit our website. That recording is posted under our statewide meetings. So we're going to kind of dive in right now. We are in the midst of Ohio's budget season. In Ohio, in the odd numbered years, of which, of course, we are in right now, we do the bulk of the statewide kind of fiscal appropriations for the next biennium. So right now we are voting on what will be the budgets for 2026 and 2027. Kind of the two big budgets that we talk about during this season are the transportation and the operating budgets. So we're going to start by talking about the transportation budget. This is the one that is moving right now. It has been drafted. We've got House Bill 54, which was released earlier this week. The House is expected to move very, very quickly on this. They're taking a very aggressive stance on moving this through. Amendments are due next week on February the 13th. They expect to have what's called a substitute bill by February 18th. And then just to kind of keep an eye on how this all works, this bill is due to be signed into law by the governor by March 31st. So, you know, his signature needs to be on an approved version of this bill no later than the end of March. The other big budget is the operating budget. It is still currently being drafted. Amendments are going to be due no later than March the 14th. They expect to pass it out of the House by April 9th. And it is much like the transportation budget, there is kind of a statutory due date of June the 30th. So that it can go into effect on July 1st. So those are the two budgets that we are currently navigating, although right now transportation has most of the spotlight on it. We expect to see testimony on both of these budgets, not only in the Finance Committee, which is where they're both assigned, but you will see sections of testimony depending on the topic in as many as 13 other committees. The bulk of the transportation budget hearings are going to happen in the House Transportation Committee, so expect to see a lot of activity there. There's already been some testimony earlier this week from kind of some key players. And this did change a little bit from past General Assemblies. So I hesitate to talk about the way that we used to do things when we've changed them significantly, but in prior General Assemblies, the bills were assigned to the Finance Committee in the House, and then there were a number of subcommittees under the Finance Committee that heard testimony. What they are doing in the General Assembly this year, and presumably going forward, is instead of having those subcommittees, they will just be heard in the standing committee that makes the most sense. So I'll give you an example. There used to be a finance subcommittee on transportation. There will no longer be that subcommittee. They will just hear transportation related testimony in the standing transportation committee. And, you know, that would apply to a number of other different specific sectors that are covered by the budgets. I would encourage everybody to get this website and bookmark it in your browser if you're interested in how this plays out. It's lsc.ohio.gov. And then there is a tab for Budget Central. When we get through the slides, I've actually got that queued up on my Chrome, and we can take a look at what that looks like. But LSC, or the Legislative Service Commission, those are the folks that actually write the laws. So they're the ones that you give a very vague idea of what you want it to look like, and they create the legislative language. They're ideally they do a good enough job that there's no challenges, but they're the ones that really manage this process, and they've got a specific tab for this budget process with a lot of good information on it that we'll show you a little bit later in the presentation. So I'm going to go through kind of the process of what this looks like. And again, this applies not only to the transportation budget, but also to the operating budget. We've got two different things that are happening. Not really at the same time, but there is progress being made on the operating budget even as we speak. So budgets are introduced. This happens in the House chamber. That's where all of the budgeting starts. What you're looking at right here is the House Finance Room, room 313 in the State House. And these are, the hearings that kind of introduce these bills. And, just to call out a very good friend of ours, if you look all the way to the right, the very last person that you can see sitting on the dais, that is State Representative Michelle Grimm from the Toledo area. She has been one of the most outspoken advocates for passenger rail expansion in Ohio. So I'd like to recognize her while we've got the chance. Budget process, again, begins in this House Finance Committee. Other testimony is going to be heard in other committees for other aspects of the bill. So at some point, and again, we're looking at probably February 18th for the transportation budget, we adopt what's called a substitute bill. So instead of amending the existing bill with what could potentially be hundreds of different amendments, they will actually completely rewrite the bill and offer a substitute instead of what was originally introduced. This isn't very uncommon, particularly with large bills that have many changes. So don't be surprised when you see that there's been a complete substitute put in for the bill. This will be adopted in the Finance Committee. They will vote on it. Presumably it will pass, and it'll go to the House floor where it will also be voted on. So then the budget goes over to the Senate. What you're looking at here is the Senate, the former Senate Law Library. It's now called the Finan Room, F-I-N-A-N, named after Senator Finan. And what's ironic is we do finance hearings in it. So there's, whether you say the Finan hearing room or the finance hearing room, you're talking about the same place, and you're looking at it right now. It's a beautiful room in the State House. We will have basically the same hearings on the Senate side that we do on the House side. Now, the two chambers are going to have different priorities, kind of depending on what the legislators have in front of them right now. So this budget process will continue in the upper chamber. Senate will kind of put in their priorities, and then kind of the process continues where the bill will be passed out of the Senate Finance Committee and then onto the Senate floor. So here's the Senate floor. Assuming there are absolutely no changes from the House version, the Senate will vote to adopt the House substitute bill, and it becomes law. That will almost never happen. Again, the Senate has their own priorities. There will be multiple changes between the House version and the Senate version, and that's where we arrive at conference committee. So it is very expected that we will see a conference committee on any budgets that we see in Ohio. Again, House and Senate have very different priorities, so they're going to, have different versions of the bill. The conference committee is where we make all of those changes kind of stick together in a way that everybody can agree on. So the conference committee is made up from leadership of the respective House and Senate committees. They meet in conference. A lot of this does happen behind closed doors. And they negotiate a budget that includes the top priorities from each of the two chambers. What you will see in conference committee is there will be some items from one version of the budget or the other that are removed completely. You may see some items that are added back in, maybe something that came from that very original House bill before it became a sub bill that get kind of drafted back in. We may see some line items changed, and what I mean by that is a particular account might have started at a certain dollar amount. We might give them more money, we might give them less money, but basically the role of this finance committee is to negotiate a package that both chambers, at least the leadership from those committees, can agree on. The committee will report a new sub-bill. This happens on the Senate side of the chamber, and the Senate will approve it, and then it'll go back to the House to concur. So just to kind of walk through the process very quickly, House Finance Committee introduces the bill, they make their changes, it goes to the House floor, they approve it, goes to the Senate committee, probably going to have changes made. We have our conference committee. Senate approves the conference committee's findings, and then the House concurs. So it will have to pass the House 2 times, assuming everything plays out like this. So we're going to talk specifically about the transportation budget. Again, this is House Bill 54. It was introduced earlier this week. And we're going to talk about specifically what's included to expand passenger rail in Ohio in this transportation budget. And I've got everything that's in the transportation budget on the very next slide. So deep breath, here it comes. There we go. Unfortunately, there is no specific language right now to improve or expand passenger rail in Ohio, but that is not, all is not lost. So let's talk very quickly again about the 3 priorities that we've been talking about here at All Aboard Ohio for the better part of the last year as we've planned for this transportation and operating budget process. Number 1, we want to rejoin the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, or MIPRC. Number 2, we want to establish an Office of Passenger Rail. And number 3, we want to fully fund the corridor ID process steps 2 for the 3CD route, the Cleveland-Toledo-Detroit route, and the Midwest Connect route. So when we met with legislators last year, when we met with the governor's office, basically every meeting that we have had for the past 12 months, these are the 3 things that we have been saying we'd like to see. So we'll start with rejoining MIPRC. This membership gives Ohio a voice in planning passenger rail in the region, not just new routes, but existing routes. So we have 3 different routes that pass into Ohio, and in the case of the Cardinal, kind of on the southern part of the state, although it just dips into Ohio in Cincinnati, it does follow the Ohio River just on the other side of the border for pretty much the entirety of the state. So it does have, potentially access to that southern chunk of the state for ridership. But as we all know, the timing of station stops throughout Ohio is pretty dreadful. With the exception of Toledo and the Northwest Ohio area, these stops are almost all in the middle of the night, 1:30 to 2:30 in the morning. And this is what being a part of MIPRC really does. It gives us a voice at the table to say, okay, we would prefer to have better station stops in Ohio. And that's really the lowest hanging fruit. We're not asking for more infrastructure. We're not asking for, new routes. We're just simply asking for either improved frequency or a change in the scheduling that allows Ohioans to take better advantage of it. We have an amendment drafted right now that has been created to mirror what was House Bill 488 last General Assembly. But this also includes funding, which was not included in House Bill 488. We kind of talked about that last year a couple of times. And we've got this amendment ready to go. It's been introduced by a number of different offices from both sides of the aisle. And we've got pretty good confidence that this is going to make it into the transportation budget as it leaves the House next week. So that's the good news. We've got this MIPRC language ready to rock. For All Aboard Ohio, this is the top immediate priority for the budget. So we'll get into your advocacy a little bit later in the presentation, but in your advocacy, this is kind of the one thing that we want you to specifically call out. So we talked about creating an Office of Passenger Rail. We wanted to create a separate Office of Passenger Rail to manage these studies and then eventually ongoing operations of these state-sponsored rail routes. We did get language drafted for this to happen. However, one of our new board members, Lisa, who is on the call right now, was doing a little research and found that ORDC's mission already kind of indicates them as this Office of Passenger Rail. So I won't read it all to you, but this is ORDC's mission, the Rail Development Commission. And it specifically calls out movement of goods and people faster, and then coordinated freight and passenger rail systems. So in lieu of asking for a very specific Office of Passenger Rail, we've got a meeting with ORDC next week, Mitch and I, and we're going to really task them with, really leaning into that part of their mission, into a focus on moving people and passenger rail, and whatever that looks like under their administrative umbrella. But more than likely, the ask will be that there is a person in their office that is specifically dedicated to doing this, and that kind of accomplishes the goal that this language would. And then the final piece is to fully fund Corridor ID Step 2. So we wanted to ensure that the local match funds are already there to go when we get done with steps 1 on all 3 of these routes, so that we can just move seamlessly into step 2, leveraging this substantial federal fund from the IIJA. The great news, friends, on Wednesday, ORDC Director Matt Dietrich gave testimony in the House, and he committed to funding the 3CD and Cleveland-Toledo-Detroit steps 2 out of ORDC's operating budget. So there is no need for us to actually specifically ask for additional funding in the budget for these routes. They're going to come out of the ORDC funding, which is just absolutely great news. We're doing some discussion behind the scenes about how we can help support ORDC's funding, which will be part of the operating budget. But I think the ask to you folks will probably just be, when you do reach out to your legislators, say, hey, continue to fund ORDC because they do great work. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do right now. We've got some advocacy opportunities at kind of the 3 different levels of government that we operate in. First would be local advocacy. We want to contact our city leadership and ask them to continue to support better transit, including passenger rail. I'm going to call out somebody that's on this phone call right now, Lucas County Commissioner Anita Lopez. The Toledo area has done an absolutely fantastic job of not only supporting our advocacy with passenger rail, but also developing their Rapid Transit Authority, TARTA, in a very meaningful way, not only to support the passenger rail that already exists and potentially will come, but also to support the region. So, just very local advocacy by saying, thank you, Commissioner, that's great work, let's keep it up, is really what we're talking about there. And then use public transit when you can. I know some of us on this call, it's really not an option. I mean, there are a number of cities that either don't have public transit or don't have public transit that serves in a meaningful way, or it's just so impractical. But if you have the opportunity, whether it's just a short trip to go from point A to point B as part of your daily work, I would encourage you to do that. When we can show better ridership at all levels, it just makes the overall conversation about public transit that much better. So state advocacy, this is really where a lot of our work ahead of us is going to happen. Contact your representative and your senator right now to ask them to support passenger rail initiatives into the budget. Again, we don't have any specific dollar asks anymore. We do want to call out MIPRC specifically. It'll help Ohioans across the state and in almost every district. Obviously, we want to see expanded passenger rail and new routes. But MIPRC, having that membership there and having meaningful change in the way that passenger rail operates through Ohio right now is going to have an incredibly dramatic impact. It touches almost every single district, other than where I'm based in Central Ohio. So again, we want to call that out specifically and ask our legislators to support that amendment and support that being included in the transportation budget. And then as you do this, kind of some of the key words that we have already started hearing with the State House and kind of what the focus from our legislators is going to be are the benefits in the economic realm, in the workforce and workforce development realm, and in just general mobility. So when we talk about passenger rail and the things that it does, these are job creators. You know, the build out of passenger rail, the expansion of passenger rail is going to create good jobs. The secondary economic benefit for you know, the areas immediately around the stations and even just immediately around the tracks. We can demonstrate that this has happened every time there's been expansion across the United States. We've got opportunities to move the workforce around in a more meaningful way. And then also just general mobility. We've got opportunities to take cars off the streets and give people a better way to move around Ohio. If you do want to watch the hearings, they are all available on the Ohio channel. They've got a website, it's ohiochannel.gov. And you can watch every one of the transportation hearings, every one of the finance hearings, the Senate and the House. Their floor hearings are all available. And they've also got the recordings of all of those hearings. So if you wanted to see specifically, I'd flag the Transportation Committee hearing on Wednesday with Director Dietrich. You know, he was really clear about their role, and there were some very pointed questions from some of the legislators about passenger rail that I think would be good for everybody to watch. So federal advocacy, what can we do at the federal level right now? Again, I would encourage people to contact their members of Congress and the two senators and ask them to support public transit and passenger rail. I'm going to take a very brief side quest right here because we've gotten a lot of questions kind of at the All Aboard Ohio office about the funding and, you know, potential threats. I don't want to dwell on this. All federal funding right now has been paused. So yes, passenger rail funding has been paused, but that doesn't mean that there has been a specific attack on transit or passenger rail. I know at the end of the day, that's not a difference because the funding has been paused, but I think ideologically, there's a huge difference there that, again, transit and transportation are not being specifically targeted, and I don't expect them to be. I think we are going to continue to see, particularly from the IIJA funding, an investment in these projects. Which again, that's a huge thing that we can talk about with our members of Congress and senators is the IIJA funding has an expiration date, and that is at the end of 2026. We are looking at projects that will take 5, 10, maybe 15 years. So we really need to renew this funding for projects that are already underway. I think it's very unlikely that we will see an IIJA 2 with that same level of funding, but I think it's very appropriate for us to ask for funding to continue for the projects where we've already got shovels in the ground. And then finally, in the world of just all advocacy, we need your help with research. Mitch, our board president, is working on a project where we are doing kind of some granular research on all of our different representatives, kind of at all levels of government, so that we can figure out what makes them tick and really do a better job of advocating specifically to those elected officials. So if you are interested in that, contact Mitch. Mitch, I'll have you drop your All Aboard Ohio email in the chat so that people know how to get a hold of you. But we are planning a meeting on this Monday, February 10th at 7 p.m. via Zoom to really go over what that research is going to look like and how you can help.
We know that transit advocates, one of our skills is research. So we want to put that skill to as good of use as possible and really prepare folks when they go in to have meetings. We want to know everything we can about who we're meeting with. So that's where all of you can be a great help.
And it really will. The more that we know, a lot of times it's just that one little thing. I'll give an example. I had a meeting very early in the last General Assembly with a representative, and I happened to notice over his shoulder he had a model of a John Deere tractor on his shelf. And my grandfather, my whole family have been John Deere owners forever, and my grandfather was a salesman, and we just made that a conversation point. And that's, it's those little connections that we can make. So if there's a connection that we're able to make with an elected official that just makes it that much more comfortable for us to be in a room having a conversation, that's the type of thing that we want to call out. So as you know, we do have a passenger rail day of advocacy coming very soon. We did have to shift the date slightly. It's now on March the 5th. Um, and I would like to say this is the beginning of our advocacy, not the end. We are really looking at this in terms of our goals as to sit down with very specific targeted legislators, so party leadership, both parties, both chambers, members of these finance and transportation committees in both chambers, because they're the ones that have, the most direct control over the budgets, and then new members of our state legislature that may not understand, kind of the priorities that we've got surrounding passenger rail. If you take all of these groups together, we end up with about 2/3 of the 132 people that have their offices there at the State House. So those are our focus. If we have opportunities to meet with other folks, we will certainly do that. We're being very mindful of the capacity that we're going to have on that day. But those are the folks that we're specifically targeting because they're the ones kind of pulling the levers in what we're asking for. We're asking specifically for their feedback. We want to know what their concerns are, what questions they might have, what thoughts they've got about passenger rail. And then we're going to use those answers to develop our future advocacy. So kind of think of what we're doing on March the 5th as investigation and research one-on-one. After this day of advocacy, we are going to develop specific targeted messaging for specific legislators, and we are going to activate the members, and that means you, to reach out. So it might be something as simple as, okay, we met with Representative Smith, and Representative Smith thinks that the best part of passenger rail is being able to work while you are moving around. So we will develop our specific targeted messaging to Representative Smith around that and just really give that reinforcement that this is good and this is why it's good. And on the other side of that, if there's a particular concern that a representative might have, talking about, this is going to cost a lot, or we really don't know. We hear a lot of talk about California and their high-speed rail system and how problematic that development is going to be. So again, we can target messaging around concerns and around the comments that we get, and then engage you folks on this call to really reach out specifically to those individual people. And then again, we're also planning, we're doing the research with Mitch's group, not only at the State House level, but also at the local and federal level as well. And we really want to keep the conversation moving at all of those levels. With the local officials, I think it's going to be a lot more just thank yous and engagement. At the federal level, I think we're going to, again, be asking a lot for, just continued support of these initiatives. But then at the state level, again, we're going to have these very specific conversations we'd like to have you have. And that's all I've got for our presentation. So I'm going to change what I am sharing quickly. And I want to show you a couple of the websites that are available here. And I'm going to go through these kind of quick just to show you what's here. So this is the lsc.ohio.gov site that we talked about early in the presentation. So this is what you arrive at when you go to that website. And then if you see there's a Budget Central tab, and you can click on that. And here's all of the information about the budget. So you've got the main operating budget, which hasn't been introduced yet, the transportation budget, which is House Bill 54. They've got information about prior year budgets. We've got all of the different reference documents that they've got here. So they've got the, historic revenues. They'll have eventually here they'll have what's called the comp doc, which has really just a line by line. Here's the expenses that are being allocated. That's a really, really good resource to quickly look and figure out what's been changed. So there's a ton of information here. I wanted to show you folks, this isn't this year, this is last year's operating budget. So last year's operating budget was House Bill 33. It was introduced again early 2023 and was signed into law on July 4th, 2023. When you pull up a particular bill on the Ohio Legislature website, which legislature.ohio.gov, It's got a little infographic here you can do to track the progress. But what I really wanted to show you on this is we've got a plethora of committee activity. Now, this is the big budget. This is the operating budget. And you can see here, we look at House committee. This is the date that the committee was heard, and then all of the different folks who testified. And just, I'm going to like scroll here for a second to show you all of the different testimony that was involved in the various committees for this transportation, or for the operating budget rather, in the last General Assembly. So you can see it's just, I mean, hundreds of different people coming in to give testimony, and talk about what their specific interests and their specific priorities are for this budget. I made some testimony for another organization that I work with, specifically about funding for the Ohio Rail Development Commission, or ORDC, just asking that funding be preserved, because they do a lot of work not only for passenger rail, but also for freight rail and rail safety across the state. So I'm still scrolling here. I'm about halfway through, just to give you an idea. There's just a ton of information. And then just as information, I'll grab Jack Marksbanks here, the former director of the Department of Transportation. You can look up the testimony that he gave. And so here's his testimony that was given in 2023. So the reason I show you that is not only can you do a little research on your own, but also understand that if you give testimony, whether it be written or whether it be oral in person, whatever you submit is a matter of public record and will be searchable and available forever and ever. And then the last tab I wanted to show you, this is the operating budget as enacted last year. And the big thing I want to show you is this number right here, almost 6,200 pages. So to give you an idea, the transportation budget is a fraction of that. It's usually between 150 and 200 pages. But I mean, we're 10 pages in and we're not even to actual legislative language yet. These are just all the different sections that are changed by this. But, we can scroll down a little further and, all of these different things, whether it be specific budget line items, whether it be policy that we're enacting, there's just thousands of different things happening in this operating budget. So that's why it's so very important for us to really cut through the noise once we get an idea of what we need to say, and, advocate in a very meaningful way. So the kind of follow up to all of that is we're going to have our passenger rail day of advocacy on the 5th. And then hopefully very soon after that, we're going to put together a plan to really advocate in a meaningful way to make sure that we're able to get all of this across the finish line. So that is all I have for my presentation. I would love to hear some questions from you folks. We're about 36 minutes in, so I think we've got plenty of time for questions. And yeah. Jess, I see your hand raised first. And I don't know, I might need to unmute you folks. So let me
Yeah, so as far as the short, I mean, the last year there was a specific piece of legislation around MIPRC that we were talking about testimony for, and you said this week there's is there something going on this week with the didn't you say it was going to be pass amendments by the 13th? Is there testimony going on this week for the specific transportation aspect of the well, first of all, is it going to be the transportation committee or the finance committee? And then, like, is there testimony and stuff going on this week leading up to the amendments, or?
So I'll bite that one off. Yes, there is testimony this week. It will be heard in the Transportation Committee on Tuesday and Wednesday. Mitch will be providing testimony on behalf of All Aboard Ohio. He's going to make the trip up to Columbus to offer that testimony on Wednesday. And I think kind of the other part of the question that you're asking is around the MIPRC amendment. We have already gotten a number of legislators to offer that amendment up. So I am very confident that you will see that introduced either in the Transportation Committee or in the Finance Committee, and kind of folded into the transportation budget. There's really I don't want to belittle any taxpayer dollars, but it is a very small dollar amount that we are asking for. And I don't think there's really any pushback from any of the legislators to get those dollars assigned and get that language put into the transportation budget.
So now would be a good time to maybe write to the Transportation Committee about the things that All Aboard Ohio wants to see added into this bill. But it's kind of part of the process of adding amendments.
Well, I would say again, you can certainly feel free to reach out to your local elected official. You've got, the greater Northwest Ohio has a lot of support from both sides of the aisle. So, you can feel very comfortable reaching out to any of the legislators up there. And just, again, I would focus very much on supporting passenger rail and adopting the amendment to rejoin MIPRC, and kind of leave it at that. I don't know that we need to go real deep into any further discussions, because we don't want to complicate things. Those are really the two big asks that we've got, and we want to make sure, as these legislators are receiving a lot of communication, because this is a very busy time, that we don't get lost in the noise. Okay,
so because it sounds like when you said March 5th is kind of the beginning, that'll be, even though that seems like it's kind of late in the process compared to what you described, that at that point there'll be more specific information out about talking points. Do you have some specific talking points in the All Aboard Ohio materials on the website now? Or
I mean, we can certainly
the workforce and moving people around. And
I think let's focus on what the asks that we have presented in this presentation were, and I'll resend a screenshot. I'm finding the slide right now. So like John said, I mean, I think the key is to tell your individual story, and that's the best talking point that you can provide. Would be, because we're going to be bringing the All Aboard Ohio Central talking points on Advocacy Day as well.
Is there specific like the materials, like the witness slip and stuff for testimony? But it was a different committee last year, so we can't use the same one. So, but they kind of don't send it out till right before these hearings, right?
Yes, those witness slips will go out with the committee announcements. So kind of keep an eye out for those. I think
Matt has a question.
I was going to say, I saw another hand, so.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, Matt.
My question is, would All Aboard Ohio be interested in helping use marijuana and alcohol and cigarette sales or sin taxes to help pay for more passenger rail through a ballot measure? That way, we have extra money coming in, and there's less impaired drivers on the road because they can just take the train. And would All Aboard Ohio be interested in helping out with the paperwork and helping out with getting the petition signatures to get that on the ballot?
I will answer that in an ideologic sense, and then I will defer to leadership for the fundamental. So we are working again with our friends at Scioto Analysis, who did our economic impact study, and they are currently working on a funding model study, and step 2 of that study, which we should have in our hands in the next week, deals with opportunities that we would have for income that can be used for passenger rail operations. One of the things that Rob at Scioto Analysis and I have discussed is the use of, sin tax, because it is a pretty popular funding source in a lot of our peer states, particularly Michigan, where they use, a pretty substantial chunk of the cannabis tax to supplement the particularly passenger rail transit line items. So I think from just can this work as a funding source, we're certainly interested in exploring all options. A little inside baseball, the governor's Blue Book, which is kind of the really high level description of his thoughts on budget, really did talk about increasing sin taxes across the board, whether that be cigarette tax, whether that be cannabis tax, or whether that be gambling tax. And there's already been a bit of a pushback from the legislature about how much that is. So on one hand, I think anywhere that we can find funding that makes sense, we're certainly going to be in favor of that. But on the other hand, we need to be very respectful of the climate in the State House right now with how they look at taxation. I would defer to Mitch as to, whether or not we would have the capacity to help with an actual ballot signature initiative. Other work that I've done in other organizations, that is, and I would never want to discourage anybody, but I would start by saying that is a monumental undertaking that takes thousands of people and thousands of hours, because you need to collect hundreds of thousands of signatures from, a number of counties across the state. So I would certainly defer to Mitch. I don't believe we've got the capacity to take that on in a leadership role.
Yeah, I don't think so. And I think that that would probably be a second or third option for us in terms of how to get the funding. Like we do believe that we can get bipartisan support to get the funding in other ways that might be easier. But I think it's certainly good for us to have, plans A through Z. And I think that definitely is a potential option that is on our radar.
Good question, though. I mean, it's certainly something that, at least from an opportunity for funding standpoint that we are talking about. And I think when we are able to publicly distribute the new study, I think you're going to be very excited at a lot of the different things that are in it, not only in terms of kind of the costs and what that looks like, but also in terms of, the suggestions that we've got for how funding would actually happen in Ohio.
Because it really is exciting to see the diversity of ways that they're funding them in other states. It can go everywhere from a separate institution that handles the funding to just annual funding, or I guess biannual funding in the budgets. A good example is in the state of Missouri. They have increased their funding for passenger rail, I think for the past 3 or 4 budgets in a row. And a big part of that was due to studies that proved economic impact and are promoting their state-supported route, the Missouri River Runner.
Good question, though. Anything else? I know this is kind of there's a lot to talk about, and I would say a lot of this happens very, very quickly. So we would just ask for your grace as we move through this process. Mitch and Lisa know I had to completely redo the slide deck after Matt Dietrich's testimony on Wednesday, because our whole advocacy plan changed because of what we need to, what we need to focus on right now. Patron user, are those our friends in Youngstown? I'll grab you, and then Jess will come back to you after theirs.
Yes, that is us in Youngstown. We have 2 or 3 comments. I'll start with mine. Is on the advocacy day, is that just for like you board members? Are you encouraging regular citizens to attend? That's my question. And then there's a couple more questions.
Sure. So the short answer to that, the advocacy day is split into kind of 3 different pieces. The first is the one-on-one meetings, and those are going to be specific board members where we are pairing board members up with other groups. So it won't just be all aboard Ohio. We've got representatives from Amtrak. We've got local and county elected officials from across the state. We've got people from the metropolitan planning organizations. So we're trying to be very specific and intentional with how those groups are put together and then how they are paired with the legislators that they're meeting. There are two other pieces to that. The first is that March the 5th, which is a Wednesday, there is Senate session. So we're inviting people that are just interested in how the process works to come down or up or over and attend Senate session so that they can see that. And then we're going to have immediately to follow, we'll have a tour of the State House that's led by the Cap Square Review and Advisory Board, which is really nice. You get an opportunity to see kind of all the different pieces of the historic State House. And then the final component is we are having a reception at 5 p.m. That we would really like to have just incredible density at. And that'll be an opportunity to talk, again, one-on-one with the legislators, but in a much less formal role. They'll be there just to enjoy, snacks and our company. So again, we'd invite you to be there definitely for parts 2 and 3. And then the part 1, we have targeted specific members of our board to participate in those.
Thank you for clarifying that. By the way, I'm Mary Krupa, and I'm going to hand it over to to Dave Mangold. He has a couple of questions and comments.
Absolutely.
Yeah, former longtime member. I got to get my dues paid again. Dave Mangold, like to get back aboard and help. One of the things I've identified here in the state, particularly I just saw it today on the way in Youngstown, is we need to better preserve existing railroad rights-of-ways, future passenger rail corridors. Might we be able to ask for any funding for that sort of preservation?
So that's a great question. And I know that's a topic that comes up pretty regularly, particularly in areas like yours that are in what I would consider to be the what's next part of the state. So, we've got these 3 corridors that are going to build out a really robust backbone, but then places like Akron and Canton and Youngstown and even Southern Ohio, there's opportunities for future expansion. And we want to make sure that there is, those rights of way are there when that time comes. So ORDC, under their list of duties, they actually have an office that manages the state's kind of abandoned rail inventory. So some abandoned rail is still owned by the freight rail company that might have cast it off or just stopped using it. But in many cases, that rail is then ceded to the state. Either, the state buys it or there's some arrangement made in terms of an operating agreement. But ORDC manages a pretty diverse portfolio of abandoned rail. And again, I come back to, if we keep them well funded and Mitch, maybe make a check mark in your brain. This is something we can talk with Matt about on Monday. I would envision that as being part of the passenger rail desk or passenger rail director's responsibilities, is just making sure that those assets are managed in a way that preserves them for future use. But it is definitely on our radar. There's a lot of information, or I'm sorry, a lot of infrastructure out there that is not being used that we want to kind of put a thumb on just in case down the road it is needed.
And one of the methods for preserving those corridors, our communications team actually wrote a blog post about it. So I put that in the chat if people are interested. Rail banking is the term.
Yeah, very important. The trails advocacy groups want to take any abandoned railroads they can get a hold of. I do support rails with trails. Both can exist as long as there isn't super high speed. But we can use the corridors for both, and we do need to preserve the rail corridors. The one I'm particularly thinking of is between Hudson and Akron, Ohio. That's the one that's currently in major danger. And I've also heard that the western portion of the Pennsylvania Railroad coming out of Pittsburgh is also possible up for track removal abandonment. It's already out of service. That's in another state. We've already lost the extreme east end of our panhandle here in Ohio, or at least across West Virginia. We do need to see that preserved in an adjoining state. The other thing I have is just to encourage all of this, both with abandoned and other passenger rail advocacy, is to have members attend the ORDC meetings and promote passenger rail when we have an opportunity to do so at the regular ORDC commissioners meetings.
Yeah, and I know, I'm at almost every one of them, and I know members of our Columbus chapter are regular visitors to the ORDC meetings, and in almost every case, somebody stands up at the end and discusses that. One thing that Mitch and I are going to talk with Matt about on Monday is, and I know this is kind of a point of heartburn for many of us on this call, is that commissioner representing the interests of passenger rail that has been vacant forever. And, we really need to get that filled. I feel like it will happen with this cycle. I think that part of the reason that it has remained unfilled, at least for the last year, is there are a number of other commissioners that are up for appointment this year. And I think the governor was just looking to, do everything at once. So that is a priority of ours as well, is to really make sure that passenger rail is represented in a meaningful way on the commission. Is that it from our friends in Youngstown?
Yes, thank you very much.
No, great. I appreciate good thoughts and good questions all around. So very much appreciated.
Sure.
Jessica, back to you. You're muted.
Well, one of the asks was about fully funding a couple of corridors. It was the C3&D and Toledo-Detroit. There were others identified in the study, but are they not? They're not really the legislatures. They have sort of other sponsors. Is
That's
that what
correct.
you're on those two?
So Ohio has a total of 4 different routes in the corridor ID program. The 2 that we mentioned, which are the 3CD and the Cleveland-Toledo-Detroit route, those are sponsored by the state of Ohio and managed by ORDC. So it is Ohio's responsibility to fund those. One of them is daily service on the Cardinal, which touches us down in Cincinnati, and then again along the Ohio border, Ohio's southern river border. That is sponsored by Amtrak. So the burden falls on Amtrak itself to see itself through the funding process. And then the 4th one is what we call the Midwest Connect, which goes from Pittsburgh through Columbus to places like Lima, Fort Wayne, and then on to Chicago. That is sponsored by the city of Fort Wayne in Indiana. And a lot of the administrative work is being done by the regional planning authority down here in Columbus called MIPRC. So the state really doesn't have a responsibility for funding there. We are working kind of behind the scenes with those folks to see if there's an opportunity there. But we are not asking our membership at this time to take a stance on that.
And is appointing a commissioner to ORDC specifically for passenger rail, I mean, is that part of the ask in the second point when you were talking about ORDC, or was that just ORDC in some way, ORDC focusing more on passenger rail? But
right. So what we would ask of ORDC, or let me back up. What we would ask of the legislature with respect to ORDC is that they just fully fund them. I think that's really the only ask there. That commissioner is appointed by the governor, so the legislature really doesn't have anything to do with that. We'd need to reach out directly to Governor DeWine to get that filled. And then, ORDC being more active in the passenger rail realm, that's more of a just, tasking Director Dietrich with that, which is part of the conversation that Mitch and I are going to have on Monday.
so this stuff, so these could be amendments that go, so these aren't things that are in the bill right now, but it would be possible to give testimony or just talk to your legislators about adding them as part of the amendments?
No, again, the only thing that we're really asking our legislators to do right now is to support passenger rail in a very general sense, but then specifically to support the amendment to rejoin MIPRC. Those are really the only 2 things that we need to focus on at this point, because everything else is happening outside of the legislature.
Okay, so the like specific things about the workforce and stuff, it's like that's going to be more after March 5th when you kind of have more information and you've talked to some of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think those would probably be talking points that we could develop for specific legislators, but I just include those as, potential things that can be mentioned now. I mean, I don't want to confuse the point. Like, those aren't necessarily things that we are advocating for. Those are just, bullet points that we might use in our advocacy, saying that, we are asking you to support passenger rail because passenger rail supports economic development and mobility and, would create a robust workforce throughout the state. I mean, those are just really talking points.
But you want us to, because it seems like in the meantime, we should, like, if they're going to start adding amendments and they're starting to develop the bill between now and March 5th, it's like you said, these things are happening quickly, but you also said March 5th is the sort of the beginning of.
Correct. I mean, I would just say, to hopefully unconfuse this, the only thing that we would ask right now, again, is just general support of passenger rail and supporting the amendment to rejoin MIPRC. I mean, everything else is, you can certainly mention the benefits of passenger rail, but our specific asks of our legislature is just to support passenger rail in a general sense, and then that amendment for MIPRC.
Oh. And that is the
Dan has a question.
transportation committee, not the finance committee.
It's in the transportation committee right now, but I would, I think the most impact you would have would be to reach out to your specific legislator, the people that represent you, because you can start by saying, I am a constituent, which is a very important phrase among our elected officials. Dan, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up maybe sometime last year, there's another agency that was trying to advocate for a budget process, and they sent out basically like a newsletter that said, hey, this is the things that we're trying to advocate for this time around. And they just had a clickable link to the legislators or whatever. It might have been ODOT, but it was a clickable link to the submission form. Once you clicked on it, it was pre-populated with, the typical like request, and then you could add or change, if you wanted to add anything. But it made it really simple. Like, it was almost like 2 clicks and you had sent, essentially like your same advocacy out to the process. And so that newsletter got shared out to a whole bunch of agencies around, and we were all able to just really quickly respond and get that out. So I'm just saying, I'm wondering if we could do something similar to that and then share it widely at the right times, where we're kind of, I don't mean like flooding in a bad way, but like making sure that when we have the appropriate moment, like we're all able to really quickly jump on and send those out with really simple means.
Absolutely. And I'm familiar with, there's a couple of platforms that do that type of advocacy, kind of the back end advocacy piece. And unfortunately, many of those platforms are quite expensive. So I think one of the other organizations we've partnered with has offered to sponsor that for us, which we'll definitely pursue as we've got specific asks. But in the short term, I think one thing that we'd be able to do, Dan, is to put together maybe like a clickable Google Doc that at least you can find your legislator and copy and paste. I know that's not as ideal as being able to, just do the 2 or 3 click and it's sent out method. But at least we can lower those barriers in a more meaningful way. And Mitch and I will certainly work to get that done.
And I will say, just to give confidence in the organization, for the long distance rail study last year, we did something similar with our within our means, which was we created clickable links that when you clicked on it, it would auto-populate an email and have the sending and subject line and everything filled in for you. We spread that link out to our membership and even wider, and we got over 1,000 submissions using that link. So that was free. Ideally, yes, if we're going to work with our partners to be able to get access to the paid version that's going to be more specific to your representative, that's ideal. But no, we're doing everything we can to get as many people's voices heard as possible. And it's really inspiring to see how many people participated.
Well, we are at an hour, friends. I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm going to drop my email in the chat. I know there's probably a lot of emails, or I'm sorry, a lot of questions that might not have been answered, or you might not have thought of yet. But when that time comes, and when that question pops into your head, feel free to reach out. There is me. And, you know, for those that are going to be a part of the March 5th Day of Advocacy at any capacity, we're looking forward to seeing you. We will not see you statewide before that day. So if you were part of that, looking forward to seeing you on the 5th, and then we'll have our statewide meeting immediately following. Again, any questions that you'd have at all, please feel free to reach out via email. And other than that, I want to thank you for giving us your time this morning. And I hope you learned something about the budget process. And again, I would just ask for the grace that this moves very, very quickly, and we have already had to adapt pretty substantially to our requests. So let's see, Commissioner, I see your information there. We will definitely reach out. Thank you so much. And everybody, I want you to have a lovely day.